This is still unanswered. I'm Maya Ellison. Today, the disappearance of Dr. Sneha Anne Philip, a case that sits uncomfortably at the intersection of a personal mystery and one of the largest national tragedies in modern American history. On the night of September 10th, 2001, Sneha shopped in Lower Manhattan. The next morning, the world changed. She was never seen again. 3 questions have circled her story for 2 decades. Did she run toward the World Trade Center to help? Did she vanish for reasons unrelated to the attacks? And how do institutions decide who is and who is not counted as a victim? To help me untangle the facts from the narratives, I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Cho. Daniel, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Maya. It's a difficult story to sit with, and I appreciate how you're approaching it. Careful, patient, and honest about ambiguity.
Yeah. I want to start, before we get into the competing theories, with who Sneha was, not just the headlines. Can you tell listeners the essentials of her background?
Sure. Sneha Anne Philip was born in 1969 in Kerala, India, to a Malayali Christian family. She and her family emigrated to the United States, and she was an impressive student. Johns Hopkins for undergrad, then medical school at Chicago Medical School. She trained in internal medicine and worked in New York. Friends and family described her as creative. She painted, socially engaged, and committed to medicine. She married a fellow doctor, Ron Lieberman, in May 2000. They lived in Battery Park City, a short walk from the World Trade Center. Those basic facts matter because they're the anchor points for everything that follows.
Right. Proximity, profession, those are the threads that make the 9/11 theory plausible. But Sneha's life was messy in the way lots of people's lives are lived behind closed doors. There were professional troubles, disputes at Cabrini Medical Center, a pending misdemeanor related to reporting an assault, and later a residency at St. Vincent's where she had to attend counseling. The NYPD records highlighted alcohol issues and nightlife. Her family told a different story. They said she was being bullied, discriminated against, maybe even punished for speaking up. Daniel, how should we hold those conflicting portraits?
We have to bracket moral judgment and focus on what the records actually say. There is evidence of disciplinary problems and a pending charge. There's also testimony from her family and husband that paints a more sympathetic picture, that any drinking was a response to stress, that she was an artist and not a caricature. From a forensic psychiatric perspective, what matters is this. When institutions, police, media, courts start to rely on behavioral inferences to explain an absence, they often import cultural biases. Nightlife, sexuality, and alcohol are easy shorthands for voluntary disappearance or problematic behavior. But those shorthands can obscure the more mundane possibilities: accidental death, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or, yes, being a casualty of a much larger event.
The last 24 hours of her confirmed life are where the narrative forks. Let's walk through that period carefully. On September 10th, 2001, it was her day off. She chatted with her mother online for about 2 hours in the afternoon. She mentioned a friend's wedding reception planned at Windows on the World. She seemed ordinary in that chat. Around 7:18 p.m., CCTV at Century 21 on Church Street captured her buying lingerie, a dress, sheets, quite a lot of items, almost $550 worth, and later 3 pairs of shoes. A clerk later said she was with another woman, but Ron, reviewing the footage, found Sneha alone. After that, the timeline gets thin. There's a 4 a.m. call from the apartment line to Ron's cell that morning. Ron doesn't recall taking it. And then, crucially, there's lobby footage from the building time-stamped 8:43 a.m., 3 minutes before the first plane hit. Ken Gallant, a private PI, found that lobby clip. It shows a woman entering, waiting, and then leaving. She's silhouetted. Some see that figure and think, that's Sneha. Others say the image is too poor to be sure. Daniel, your read?
The timing is certainly arresting. 8:43 a.m. is so close to 8:46 a.m. that if the woman is Sneha and she left then, there's a rational path to the theory that she left toward the towers to help. But the evidentiary hurdles are significant. The image is low resolution, there are no identifying items like the Century 21 bags, and there's no independent witness placing her at ground zero. In a massively chaotic scene, absence of witness can be explained by chaos, but absence of direct evidence, DNA, belongings, hospital logs, is also noteworthy. For a clinician, you weigh probabilities. The court later did too. But scientifically, we can't be certain.
Let me ask you about motivation. People have asked, would a doctor like Sneha, off-duty, run toward the danger? We know doctors sometimes act that way, but is that a reliable assumption?
Not reliably. People are complex. Many health professionals, in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, respond altruistically, but many do not. Traumatic stress and self-preservation instincts vary. You can't generalize. But anecdotal reports from 9/11 include off-duty medical personnel who went to help and perished. Those stories are true and documented. So the profession makes the hypothesis plausible. It does not prove it.
So we're left with competing plausible stories. 1. Sneha was in or near ground zero and died helping. 2. She disappeared for reasons unrelated to the attacks: foul play, overdose, or purposeful disappearance. The NYPD's early portrayal leaned toward the second story. They emphasized nightlife, alleged substance use, and even claims that she left with women she met, or that personal fights occurred. The family and Ron rejected that picture. How does institutional bias shape those early reports, Daniel?
Institutions rely on narratives that are legible and defensible under pressure. After a mass casualty event, the police are overwhelmed. They need to triage. That triage can produce shortcuts. If someone has disciplinary records or a pending charge, those become explanatory anchors for missing person investigators. There's also a moralizing impulse, to explain an absence by invoking bad choices. And in Sneha's case, allegations around nightlife and sexuality are precisely the kinds of details that can be weaponized to justify a non-9/11 explanation. This is not to defend bad actors, it's to point out that selectively highlighted facts can push an investigation in a certain direction.
Which brings us to the moral cost. Think about the family. They saw her removed from the official WTC victim list in 2004. Can you imagine that? To have the city say, in effect, we're not counting your loved one among the fallen. That's not only bureaucratic, it's symbolic and financial. And yet, in 2008, after a legal fight, the appellate division concluded there was clear and convincing evidence she died in the towers and re-added her name. What does that back and forth tell us about truth-making after catastrophe?
It tells us that truth in these contexts is as much constructed as discovered. Courts weigh probabilities and may privilege certain narratives when evidence is circumstantial. The appellate court criticized elements of the NYPD's report as speculative. It favored the weight of the circumstantial case, proximity, profession, the lobby video interpreted as likely her, and the court made a humanitarian decision as much as a factual one. Legally, Designating someone as a victim can remedy some harms, like benefits eligibility and symbolic inclusion. But it doesn't produce forensic certainty about what exactly happened that morning.
And for the family, that legal victory was, by some accounts, relief. But it didn't answer the everyday questions. Where did she spend the night on September 10th? Who, if anyone, did she meet after Century 21? What was the 4 a.m. call? What exactly happened between 8:43 and 8:46? None of those granular answers exist. Before we dig more into the competing theories, I want to pause and give listeners a sense of how the physical apartment scene factored into the narrative. Ron re-entered the apartment after the towers fell and saw dust tracked in. There were paw prints from the two kittens, but no human footprints in the dust. That detail has been invoked as evidence she never returned after the collapse. How persuasive is it?
It is evocative and emotionally persuasive, less conclusive scientifically. The presence of only kitten tracks suggests no one walked through the apartment after the dust settled. Yes. If Sneha had been in the apartment after the collapse and left afterward, you'd expect human footprints, unless someone cleaned. But the absence could also mean she left earlier and didn't return, which fits both the went to help and went out and vanished theories. It's an important piece of the puzzle, but not the keystone.
The lobby footage is the keystone everyone argues about. Ron's private investigator, Ken Gallant, located a clip showing a woman in the lobby at 8:43. Ron thought it could be her. NYPD eventually took a skeptical stance. The appellate court, however, treated the footage as likely Sneha for the purposes of its ruling. Daniel, how does a court evaluate such ambiguous imagery?
Courts operate with different standards than forensic labs. The legal standard here wasn't absolute proof. It was whether the balance of probabilities, elevated to clear and convincing in the appellate posture, supported the conclusion. The court took into account the totality of circumstantial evidence. She lived a block or two from the towers. She was a physician. She was seen at Century 21 the evening before. Lobby footage shows a woman leaving minutes before the first impact. The court also criticized excessive moralizing in the NYPD file. So the court essentially said, given the pattern and the inferences, it is more likely than not, indeed clear and convincing, that she perished in the towers. That's a legal determination, not a forensic seal.
That distinction is so important. Legal truth and forensic truth can diverge. Listeners, I want to make something explicit. I'm not trying to argue one side to the exclusion of the other. This podcast lives in ambiguity. But for fairness, we need to examine why some people think she disappeared for personal reasons. The NYPD report included claims. She had been spending nights out, sometimes with women she met. There were attendance and substance issues noted in hospital records, and at one point, her brother was reported to have found her in a compromising situation, a claim the brother later denied. There's also the fact that her brother, Ashwin, at one point told the media he'd spoken to Sneha during the attacks, a statement he later admitted was fabricated to get attention. How should that falsehood affect how we weigh the family's narrative?
It cuts both ways. On one level, Ashwin's lie is understandable in human terms. He was desperate to get help for his sister in the chaos of 9/11. Desperation can lead to irrational acts. But in the realm of public credibility, that lie became a tool for skeptics to question everything the family said. So the family's credibility suffered, sometimes unfairly. Clinically, you have to separate the understandable human behavior from the probative value of their assertions. A lie about a phone call doesn't invalidate the other circumstantial evidence pointing toward the towers.
That's a nuanced take I appreciate. Now, let's explore the alternative theory in more detail. If Sneha's disappearance was not connected to the towers, what are the plausible scenarios? Foul play after leaving a bar and meeting someone? An accidental overdose? Or, though harder to imagine, a deliberate attempt to vanish? The arguments for that side rest on her documented instability at work, nightlife, the unaccounted hours overnight, and the lack of direct evidence tying her to ground zero. Which of those carry the most weight, in your view?
From a probabilistic standpoint, the strongest points for non-9/11 scenarios are the unaccounted hours and the presence of risk factors, job instability, a pending charge, nightlife that may have included risky contacts. Those things do increase vulnerability to victimization. But vulnerability doesn't equate to outcome. For foul play, we'd ideally want a suspect or location. Neither exists in this case. For vanishing intentionally, we'd want evidence of planning, absent. So both theories have supporting and weakening elements. With missing person cases, what's often decisive is either a piece of physical evidence or a credible witness. Sneha's case lacks both.
And that lack is what makes it so painful. There's also a deeper ethical question here about hero labels. The appellate court declared her a 9/11 victim and effectively acknowledged a narrative of her as someone who died in service to others. But what does it mean to call someone a hero when the factual basis is uncertain? Is it compassionate? Does it risk erasing nuance?
Excellent question. Hero narratives serve communal needs. They offer meaning to tragedy and help families feel their loss matters. But they can also be reductive. In Sneha's situation, the legal system concluded that the balance of circumstantial evidence supported that designation. That doesn't mean we should ignore complexity. The best approach is to hold heroism as a possible truth without demanding it be the only truth. Compassion for families and intellectual honesty in evaluating evidence are both necessary.
That balance between honoring grief and upholding evidentiary rigor is central to this show. I want to take a moment and paraphrase really, the closing lines from the appellate decision, because the court's language matters. The court criticized the NYPD report for moralizing and engaging in conjecture about Sneha's character, then concluded that, weighing the totality of evidence, including her proximity, profession, shopping the night before, and the lobby footage, there was clear and convincing evidence she died in the towers. That is a legal finding. It resolved one set of consequences, but it didn't resolve the factual mystery for many listeners and for many family members who still want to know more about where she was and what she did between those hours.
Exactly. And the court's decision shows how institutions can correct one another. The medical examiner removed her name in 2004 because of insufficient evidence. The family challenged that. The court stepped in and made a determination that had practical and symbolic effects. Institutions, police, medical examiners, courts have different remits and methods. Sometimes they reach different conclusions. That's a structural reality we need to keep in mind.
Let me ask you something a little more clinical. In cases like Sneha's, where someone vanishes into a mass disaster, there's a psychological phenomenon where people want a coherent story. Either she died a hero, or she was running away, or she was victimized because of choices. How do those needs for closure affect families and investigators?
The need for coherent narratives is powerful. Human brains prefer stories with beginnings, middles, and ends. For families, ambiguity is one of the worst forms of grief. It prevents rituals, closure, acceptance. Investigators, under pressure, may prefer neat explanations to chaotic unknowns. That preference can bias searches for evidence to fit a favored narrative. Ethically, we have to resist that urge, to accept uncertainty when warranted, and to keep investigating with openness. For families, supportive counseling that acknowledges ambiguity as valid grief is crucial.
We've been careful to include both the human tenderness and the procedural critique. I want to talk about the media and public interest next. Over the years, sneakers of true crime shows and long-form features returned to Sneha's case. New York Magazine, The New York Times, multiple podcasts. What's interesting is how each retelling picks different details to emphasize. Some highlight the romance of the heroic doctor, others dwell on scandal. How does media framing influence public memory in a case like this?
Media frames set the contours of public empathy. When a story emphasizes alleged misconduct, readers may default to suspicion. When it emphasizes proximity and profession, readers are more likely to embrace tragedy and heroism. The cumulative effect is that the public memory becomes a collage of competing frames, and people gravitate to the narrative that aligns with their own moral lenses. That's why critical journalism that surfaces primary documents and resists cherry-picking is important. Your show tries to do that, present contradictions, and invite listeners to sit with them.
Thank you. I do want to make clear one more thing before we move to the closing: the human toll on Ron and the family. Ron lost his wife and also had to defend her reputation in public, while years of uncertainty drug him through private grief. The family's fabrication of the phone call, understandable, as Daniel said, also had consequences. There are no villains in this story who were clearly responsible for a crime. Rather, there's a mess of institutional failure, public rumor, legal strategies, and human desperation, which leaves us asking the podcast's title question, still unanswered. Daniel, before we close, what are the unresolved forensic or investigatory avenues that could, in theory, still be pursued?
Realistically, most forensic avenues are closed by time. The most promising potential leads would have been locating that mystery woman the clerk mentioned at Century 21, getting better quality copies of the lobby footage and any other nearby surveillance, checking hospital logs, morgues, and morgue DNA databases for unidentified remains from that period. Unfortunately, over time, evidence degrades and memories fade. However, advances in DNA technology have identified remains in other cold cases decades later. If DNA or personal effects suspected to be Sneha's ever surface and are tested, they might produce answers. But absent new evidence, the case remains stubbornly unresolved in the factual sense.
So the door's not absolutely shut, but realistically, it's narrow. Let's end with the questions we want listeners to sit with. Leave them with some sparks to turn over. First, who was the woman in the lobby at 8:43 a.m.? Was it truly Sneha? And if so, where did she go next? Second, what happened between 7:18 p.m. on September 10 and the early hours on the 11th? Third, if she went to help at the towers, why is there no witness or record placing her there? Is that simply chaos or something else? Fourth, if the disappearance had occurred on a different day, would our investigative responses and public narratives look different? Finally, what does calling someone a hero do for the family and for public memory when the facts are so murky? Daniel, any closing thought?
Sneha's case reminds us to be humble in our judgments. It asks us to honor human complexity, to be skeptical of easy moral frames, and to keep searching where we can. Above all, it's a case about people, a family, a husband, colleagues, all grieving uncertainty. That should temper both our curiosity and our compassion.
Thanks, Daniel. And to our listeners, if you want to read the documents cited in this episode, the appellate decision, the New York Magazine piece, the Century 21 footage reports, we'll link to them in the episode notes. I encourage you to look. There's a difference between leaning into narrative and wrestling with source material. Before we go, I want to leave you with a quiet moment to imagine Battery Park City that morning. The city, full of ordinary movement, Starbucks cups, a woman's shopping bags, a cat's paws making prints in a dust layer she never crossed. This is Still Unanswered. I'm Maya Ellison. Daniel Cho, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Maya. Take care.
If you're carrying questions about a loved one who vanished, or if this episode touched something in you, resources for support are in the show notes. Next week, we'll look at another case that resists tidy endings. Until then, sit with the questions, not only the answers. Music swells, then fades out.